Have everyone here. Amen. Excellent. So this is the final sermon of our kind of Christmas Advent sermon series called the Book of Advents, and it's kind of this Epiphany Sunday idea. And in this sermon series, kind of centered around this idea is that the Bible is a book of Advents. That in Advent we're looking for God to become Emmanuel, right? Like that God is coming with us. But we see all through the Bible all these different stories that where God has become Emmanuel and is with his people already. And this kind of the sermon series kind of crescendoed at Christmas Eve, and specifically in the song, O Come, Emmanuel, where the background of the song had all the stories of the stories of God's people going through as we sang those verses that matched with it. I kind of made that, and I thought it was cool. So that's kind of what we've been doing. And today we're kind of ending that with talking about following the light, talking about the Magi. But are they known as Magi? Like even in our reading today, it calls them three kings, right? And it kind of leads us into all those songs of "We Three Kings of Orientar," right? Like that's carrying gifts. We traveled so far. I don't know lyrics that well. I tried to do karaoke while we were up in Atlanta. It didn't go well. All right, at least for me. Other people, magnificent, right? Well, magnificent. Like that's, but that's we have all these things and about the wise men and all the stuff of Christmas. But the big point is that they follow the light of God. So let's actually get into some of the reading and see what is going on here. So we could see now this is the Christmas story in Matthew. You know, all of our memory of like pageants of like going to inns and knocking on doors and all the pageantry of Mary having Jesus, like none of it is in Matthew. This is all Matthew has right here. This is the Christmas story according to Matthew. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Cool, Merry Christmas, everyone, right? Like that's what that just fills the Christmas spirit, right there. Like but behold, like that's the Christmas story in Matthew. And what we're going to see today is that Matthew, the gospel writer Matthew, remember there's 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that Matthew is wanting us to remember some of the stories, to see the new light that Jesus has us coming into. So these wise men from the east came to Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." So the wise men, yeah, we can call them wise men. They're kind of, I think the word Magi is kind of actually better. I think it's better because Magi or magician or sorcerer, watch it there. I'm talking about sorcery here in the church. Like that's kind of more in line with who these guys were, right? And we don't know how many there were. There were there were 3 gifts. So we kind of assume that there were 3. We don't know. There's even like history where people have named them. Like one of them is like Belteshazzar. Does anyone remember like the other traditional names? Oh yeah, like Casper. Like that's another one. Belchior. Like see, you guys are more righteous than me. So like that's it's but that's kind of. That's all just tradition. A lot of that came from like the Middle Ages, type of Dark Ages, I guess you could kind of say. Kind of that time frame is when all this stuff kind of came about for that. And the reason why all that stuff came about is they wanted to express importance on these Magi. They don't want us to just throw them away, even though that's kind of the sense that Matthew is wanting to get us from, because these guys are sorcerers, magicians, right? They're the wrong ones to be following the light of God, and yet they are fully following it, Okay, that's kind of the idea. That's kind of the idea. And these magi, these sorcerers, like magicians, they're these guys, not these guys specifically, but they're kind of who they are found in other parts of the Bible. Daniel is one of the places where we find these guys. If you remember, King Nebuchadnezzar of Assyria, he has all these wild dreams. And he doesn't know what they mean, so he calls all of his magicians, all of his magi, in to interpret the dream, and they can't, and they have to call Daniel, and he interprets the dream for them. We also see these guys in Pharaoh's courts in Egypt. Remember when Moses comes in there and he's like, let my people go. Remember when Chuck Heston and, let my people go. Like that's all that, and he calls his magi, his magicians, his sorcerers in, and they throw their staffs on the ground and they become snakes. Remember that? And then Moses throws his staff down. It's an even bigger snake, and it eats all the other snakes up. Like that's these guys. It's those magicians, like that kind of ilk coming from another nation, right? To coming in, and where did they go? They go to Jerusalem. They go to the place where they're like, we see a new king's star, we're following it, and we're come to pay homage to the new king. So they go up to King Herod, and it's like, hey, where's this new king that we're seeing about? And Herod's like, excuse me? What? What new king? If you know your history, you know about Herod. He was not really too thrilled about successors to the throne. Right? Because he tried actively to try to kill them all. This isn't something we find in the Bible. This is something we find in history of this Herod. So but that would have been like history, like bringing color to this. So they're like, where's this new king? And Herod's like, what? And you can see his reaction because, and Matthew's allowing us to fall into the story here. He says, this is the next verse. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. Now, here's the deal. Jerusalem was troubled with him. This is key to the point in this story. This is key. It's not just Herod and his wantings of power that is troubled here, but all Jerusalem with him is troubled. Now, here's the thing, is that Jerusalem and the king of Jerusalem, their entire system of governance, the entire theology of who they are is all about the coming Messiah. It's all about waiting for that Messiah to come. Like that is who they are. And then all of a sudden, these very wrong people, other nations come and it's like, we're here to see the new king. They're like, oh, I don't like this. And you know what's even grosser? I don't have it as a slide. What's even grosser is they know where to tell those magicians and sorcerers where to go to see the new king. You remember that in the gospel reading? Like they're like, yeah, we got together some of the scribes and we saw that there was a passage that said, go to Bethlehem. Well, you should probably go to Bethlehem, guys. And did Jerusalem and King Herod follow them? No. Herod's like, just come back and tell me and we'll squash that. I'll pay homage to what's going on, right? Like that's the story that's going on there. There's this note inside of here. Inside, it's so Jesus-y, it's so Bible-y, is that all the right people are getting it wrong, and the wrong people are getting it right there. And so here's our kind of thought for the day. As we think about the Magi looking at the light, are we following the light into the newness that God is bringing us? Or are we going back to the darkness? Are we going back to the darkness? So this idea is one that makes sense because when you think about Herod and how he was all troubled with him, they find, so the Magi go and they give their gifts to the boy Jesus, and then in a dream, it said, don't go back to Herod, just go home and go back a different way. And so they do. And what does Herod do? He gets very angry, does he? And then he does something which is very interesting, I think. He emulates the attack, it's called the slaughter of the innocents. He attacks all the firstborn sons in that area the same way, it sounds very similar to how Pharaoh kills all those babies at the beginning of Exodus with Moses in the basket, where he kills all the firstborn sons. Those stories in the book of Matthew are there to align and to show you. Because something that has filled my theology lately, and it's kind of become who I am, is something that begins in the Bible that it's like, don't go back. Don't go back. There's this warning of going constantly throughout the Old Testament of don't go back to Egypt. Don't go back to Egypt. So I'm going to show you that real quick. So there's this idea of following the light, staying away from the darkness, and not going back to Egypt. So let me show you where some of this stuff comes from, all right? So some of this comes from Exodus. And you know, it wouldn't be a sermon of Chris's if we didn't talk about Exodus just a little bit. Like that's, for those of you who are kind of newer, just get used to it, right? This is what, if you understand Genesis and Exodus, you're going to be most of the way there with the Bible. So here's Exodus. So remember what's going on in Exodus. God's people were enslaved to the Egyptians. They're enslaved to the Egyptians, and God sends Moses to say, let my people go to Pharaoh, and God rips from the clutches of Pharaoh, his people. And they go through the Red Sea, and they end up in the wilderness, in the desert, right? They're in them, and this is right in the midst of that. And it says this is Exodus 13, verse 21. And by day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them along their way, and by night, in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Do you hear that thing? At night, he gave them a pillar of fire so that they could travel by light. They could follow after the light. Now, when you think of the children of God, the nation, Israel, wandering around the wilderness, you may think of like, oh, they're just like haphazardly like wandering around. Like, no, they're following after God in all these different ways, which means that each footstep that they make when they go in is like stepping into the virgin snow. Now, some of you went back home for Christmas, right? I heard it was cold in other parts of the world. I experienced it a little bit. I went to Atlanta. It was don't laugh like that. Like that. It was 22 degrees when I get there. That's like 50 degrees of my threshold of unacceptability. 22 degrees there, and there was no snow on the ground though. But so let's not talk about snow. Let's not talk about snow. That's also just away from everything that's my being of stepping into fresh snow. That sounds awful. Like we can think about like you walk out onto a beach the beginning of the day after the tide has gone out and the sand is all smooth, right? And you step into it. No other steps are there. And it's like the first time you're walking into it. That idea is like the children of Israel going into the wilderness, following after the light, that each step is a new journey going forward, right? And they just follow the light, right? They just do that so well. Maybe not. But 3 chapters later, chapter 16, it says this. In the desert, in the wilderness, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Those are the people I like to see right there. And the Israelites said to them, if only Moses, we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food that we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. And here, right here, we begin this theology, this understanding throughout all of the Old Testament, that we begin to see it, that they're grumbling and they want to go back to Egypt. And it's almost like they're following after this pillar of fire by night. And all they want to do is, rather than making the new steps into a new world, a new understanding, a new way that God is bringing them out, they want to leave and they want to go back to darkness. You see that? And in a constant warning is not, I don't know. In the Old Testament, a constant idea in the Old Testament is, don't go back to Egypt. Don't go back to those ways. Don't go back to those things. Don't go after seeing all this stuff. But that's a thing that I think we often feel. The idea if we can just go back. I mean, that's what Herod did. He wanted to uphold his power, right? He wanted to uphold what he had. So anytime there was, he would always go back to the well of killing the people that were supposed to succeed him on the throne to keep his power. Like that's just what Herod did. He always, and Matthew ends up telling the story. It's like, look at how the king of Jerusalem, look at how he goes back to Egypt. Because what he does ends up looking like that whole story. Look how he does this. But I hear it on our own lips because we often think of it, right? We often think of of this idea. Like, so, because it's easy to fall into these things. I mean, Jesus even talks about it when he says, don't put new wine into old wineskins. So, I think we think of these things as we go back. And I am lost on my, I'm so far off of it right now. I was looking for my one quote, and it's not there. Where'd it go? Anyway, at New Year's, it's a good time for self-evaluation. That's like we can look and we're like, hey, this is what worked well, this is what didn't. That's why this whole sermon is an ad for our sermon series next week. That what this book is, it's a bunch of stories of grace. It's and how Philip Yancey describes who God is and what he does as he calls grace. And it's a bunch of stories, and what it's designed to help us do is to recognize where we are. Recognize what's going. Being honest with the situations that we are around, because so often we kind of lie to ourselves and we go, things were so much better back in Egypt. Yeah, I may have died back then, but at least I died with a full belly, is what they're saying, right? Like, in being honest with ourselves, because we say these things of going back to darkness so much, right? One of them is, if only if things could go back the way they were when I was a kid, things would be so much better. I've never heard anyone say that here before, right? If only we could go back to the meat pots in Egypt, right? Going back to darkness. If only my kids would listen to me like they did back when they were little. You're just remembering the good times, right? Like if only the churches were full like they were pre-COVID, maybe we won't say COVID, we'll say back like they were in the 50s, then things would be so much better, If only my neighbors were Christian again, read into that phrase whatever you want. If only we could go back and die in the darkness and have our bellies filled with beef stew. We end up falling into these things, and we end up making a lot of our identity and hopes and dreams only about the darkness of the past. And there's no hope there. There's no hope. And it only causes us to be bitter and angry about what's going on around. So again, I ask us, are we following after the light into the newness of where God is bringing us, or do we want to go back to the darkness? Excuse me. We want to go back to the darkness because that's what we see what Herod does. He goes back to the darkness. Now here's this, all throughout the prophets in the Old Testament, you see God describing through their voice what was going to happen. And what Nancy read a little bit ago from Isaiah shows this so well. Think about everything we've been talking about now. Think about this Isaiah verse. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, thick darkness of the peoples. You hear it? But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And how will you recognize his glory? How will you recognize his light shining throughout all of this? Nations shall come to your light, and the kings to the brightness of your rising. This is what this book is about. I appreciate the laugh, Frank. This is what this book is about. Because if you ask a common person outside the church what their opinion of church is it light? No. Maybe we can be about grace once again. Because because following God's lights leads us into the new paths that are around us. It leads us into the new things. And we see that this is what Jesus did. This is what God does, right? Like, look at what Jesus did. Who were the people that he hung out with? Did he hang out with all the righteous, the people wearing the white robes with the white... oh, dang. Right? No, like he was hanging out with the unrighteous. He was hanging out with the sinners, the tax collectors, boo hiss, right? But the prostitutes, he was hanging out with all of them. He calls the disciples into an existence so different from anything that they ever could have thought. He led them along that new thing. And the greatest command to the disciples was after he died and rose again and he ascended into heaven, he says, we are going to baptize not just those people in Jerusalem, but you're going to baptize all the nations. Everybody. That's how we say it in Georgia. We're going to baptize everybody. We're going to do that. It's going to be for all people, right? Even the foreign ones. And you look at the story of Paul, like the story of Paul on his way to Damascus. Paul, as he's going to Damascus, is to try to murder people who are practicing Christianity. He's trying to murder people to get the community back to the way it was before Jesus. You hear that? Like that is his whole point of what he's trying to do, to get rid of the bad people in his midst. And Jesus comes to him, and Nancy read Paul's letter about the grace and inclusiveness for all nations. That is how God changed Paul, the most unlikely of servants. And he's called you in his resurrection with his grace and forgiveness to bring the light of God and that newness of what God is doing, to bring it into the communities around us. So Grace Lutheran PSL, we got to get the branding right. Got to do that. Grace Lutheran PSL, this year, let's trust him. Now, I don't know where we're going to go this year. I'm supposed to, because I'm like the pastor and I'm like, this is how we go, like all that stuff. But in the last 3 years, I think we've learned that there can be things that change the course pretty readily, right? But we will go forward from here. Both us collectively and you individually in your neighborhoods, we walk towards the light, knowing that Jesus is with us and he'll always be guiding us in all of his paths, bringing that newness and good news, light and grace into all of those communities, so that those communities around us may breathe again, like, God's on my side. God is for me, and he loves me. So, Grace, with the Magi, who are the unlikeliest ones to be following that light of that star, may we with them in this epiphany follow that light of Jesus, that we and those around us may bow down and worship with Jesus in the newness of his love and grace. And I think that's good news. And we'll end it all right there. So let's say a prayer. Jesus, we thank you that you love us and that you're with us. Lord, as we look along the new paths that you have given us, continue to give us your grace and peace as we go forward, that we may see your light going forward out of us. And Lord, just give us a heart of love and grace for our neighbors around us, that we can give them your grace and peace. Amen. So thank you so much for listening to that, and thank you for being part of the church here. We